Friday was all about the US payrolls data, which showed 271,000 jobs being created in October. So, spare a thought for Canada, which had its own excellent jobs data report. Now, they created an additional 44,000 jobs last month. But, as you can imagine, this news got rather shouted down by the noisy neighbours. Now, we shouldn't look at the Canadian numbers in the same stellar terms as those created in the US, because about 3/4 of these new Canadian jobs were temporary. There was the public sector recruiting heavily to help man the polling stations for October's general election in Canada, while also in October, restaurants and hotels needed lots of bar and kitchen staff to feed Canadians who were transfixed by the Toronto Blue Jays' ultimately failed attempt to get to the World Series playoffs. But let's not be too dismissive, because unemployment fell to 7%. Now, okay, that actually was a slight drop, but the signs are there that this is because new jobs are being created rather than fewer people claiming benefit. Why do we care about Canada? Simply because the US cares. American Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen pointedly referred to Canada as an important trading partner of ours in explaining in September why the international climate was preventing the Fed from raising rates. So a big trading partner being battered by falling oil prices and dropping as it did into technical recession can't be dismissed lightly by the US. If Canada is therefore back on the up, that's another reason why the US should feel chipper about its own economic prospects. Canada's jobs boost, though, is a bit of a paradox. Falling oil prices has meant big energy company layoffs. Like another big commodity exporter, namely Australia, much of Canada's growth headwinds is in capital-intensive industries. Yet, there seems to be plenty of jobs being created elsewhere. Have a look at our first chart. This is Canada and the creation of jobs and GDP growth. And as you can see, there in the blue line is GDP coming down, and yet job creation is going up. And if we look similarly at Australia in our next chart, we'll see an even starker issue here. There in the blue chart is Australian GDP going down and a much sharper rise in job creation in Australia. Regarding Canada, as Nomura's Charles Saint-Arnaud said, an analyst at Nomura, the rest of the Canadian economy is not looking too bad. Now, that's not to say Canada hasn't got problems. China could continue to cause headwinds, and the Canadian housing bubble, just like Australia, is pretty monstrous. But at least another persistent worry on Canada's plate shows some signs of easing. US demand has been picking up, as recent export data has shown. Sentiment towards Canada, there's no doubt, has been hit. The falling oil price is pretty much responsible for that. And as our final chart shows, that has left the loonie, which is the nickname for the Canadian dollar, nursing something of a 12% fall against the US dollar this year. But a falling loonie is good news for Canadian exporters. When Canada voted in its election last month, the loonie was charging upwards, rising by nearly something like 5%. And that space of time is barely 3 weeks. But now that the market is locking in the idea of a December US rate hike, the loonie has come back down to something like a 6-week low. And if it continues to weaken on the back of renewed support for the US dollar, so much the better for the new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. It's too early to call a change in Canada's fortunes, but Mr. Trudeau has acted pretty shrewdly by appointing a top-notch businessman as finance minister, thereby dampening business worries for the time being that the new government was about to embark on a heavy-duty bout of government spending. Now, the new Prime Minister may also enjoy an extended honeymoon period because it looks like GDP could continue to pick up as it did in July and August, and therefore Canada can be pulled out of recession. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. After all, that is a trait that's very familiar to the Canadians themselves.